Let's get more now on Turkey's offensive in Syria. Malcolm Davis is a senior analyst in defence strategy and capability at the Australian Strategic and Policy Institute, and he joins me now from Canberra. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Scott Morrison says the Australian government is deeply concerned about Turkey's actions. In your view, what will be the consequences of Turkey's invasion and how extensive do you think it will be?
Well, look, the actual extent of Turkey's invasion is something that's yet to be determined, but obviously the further south they push, the greater the risk the increases. But in terms of the consequences, I think one of the problems is that the way this has been handled is that the US has abandoned key allies in the form of the Kurds to the mercy of Turkey's forces, and Turkey regards the Kurds, rightly or wrongly, as terrorist forces, and so they're not going to show much mercy to the Kurds. And so it's a terrible signal for the US to send to the international community and to their Western allies that they will so quickly abandon a key ally in an essential fight. And the other key aspect that I think is important is that it will embolden and enable Russia to expand its influence across the region. And so President Trump, in doing this, the way he's done it, has basically handed a huge gift to Vladimir Putin.
Why did the US president decide to pull troops out this week?
Well, he was elected on a mandate to withdraw the US from overseas conflicts, and so he could argue that he's doing exactly that. The problem is that the withdrawal that he's done so far is only very small. It's only about 100 troops in that particular part of Syria. And the cost and the consequences of doing so have overwhelmingly outweighed the benefits in terms of the US withdrawing from these conflicts. And so the US allies are now wondering about US commitments. There's concern about giving benefits to Russia and Iran, and also the prospect that the Kurds who are guarding Islamic State prisoners are now forced to defend themselves against Turkish forces could see those Islamic State prisoners escape and potentially reform Islamic State.
And you say that this is likely to promote Russian presence and power throughout the Middle East. Exactly where do you think we will see the ramifications in the short term?
Well, Russia obviously has a presence in Haiman Air Base and near Tartus, which is a naval port. They're essential to the survival of the Syrian regime under Bashar al-Assad. With Turkey now moving south, it's likely the Russians will come to Syria in a more extensive manner, and you could see additional Russian forces going in. But the key point is that a power vacuum is filling in the area where the Americans once were, and so the Russians are likely to move politically and strategically to fill that vacuum. They're going to have increased influence across the region because there will be a growing lack of confidence in the US.
What conversations do you think will be happening now between traditional US allies about possibly shouldering more of the load in terms of international security operations?
Look, I think that, you know, from an Australian perspective, we have to be prepared to share a greater share of the burden. We have to be prepared to do more alongside the US. I don't see the US withdrawing its support from Australia as a key ally. I'm not so certain under Trump about the US's commitment to NATO. But certainly in Asia, I think that there will be discussions ongoing about how countries like Australia and Japan and South Korea and others can work together more closely to tie the US into its Asian security commitments and make sure that the US doesn't seek to distance itself. I think the big concern I have probably would be South Korea. And Trump's suggestion that he sees the US-South Korean security relationship in transactional terms, and that if the South Koreans aren't prepared to pay his price, which is highly exorbitant, then he might be prepared to pull US forces out of South Korea. That would be a devastating move, far more serious than what's happened in Syria.
Donald Trump has tweeted that any captured IS fighters who might escape during Turkey's military operation will head to Europe. Do you believe that is likely, and do you think Western security apparatuses are now preparing for potentially an increase in terrorist attacks?
Look, I think the tweet showed a certain lack of regard and sensitivity towards Europe's security needs to suggest that, well, they're headed to Europe, so it's not our problem. I think that suggests that President Trump really hasn't thought through the issues that he's talking about. But in terms of where Europe stands on this, if you have large numbers of Islamic State fighters escaping from Kurdish prisons in that region, then yes, they might very well head towards Europe, or they might stay in the Middle East and try to resume activities as part of Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. And so, ironically, the one achievement that President Trump has been trumpeting over the past 2 years, the destruction of Islamic State, will fall apart as he goes into the 2020 presidential election, if the worst happens here and you have large numbers of Islamic State fighters escaping those prisons.
Malcolm Davis, good to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.